Hello, everyone. This is our first lecture on Chapter 1. So the title of the chapter in your book is Perspectives on Sexuality. It's kind of vague. Today we're just going to talk about kind of the historical narrative or kind of progression of what sexual attitudes were like in Western Europe throughout time. That's really going to be our emphasis today. But it does like put that into perspective a little bit, looking at the history and especially what religious institutions and really influential religious figures, what sort of effect did they have on people's attitudes about sexuality and whatnot. So it really helps us as far as looking at this on a more personal level. And it's like, well, kind of answering the question of why do people, on a psychological level, why do people have such strong opinions about sexuality, sanctions, like who's supposed to be doing and what, and all this sort of thing. And so hopefully this lecture gives some perspective on that issue. Kind of why is sexuality so controversial, yeah, in our society, and which trickles down into our psychology, which in large part can be just general emotional comfort level in talking about sexuality. A lot of people just don't talk about it at all. And I think that this lecture will kind of give some context as to why, at least in some way. So, and I pretty much follow for this lecture. I pretty much follow your book as far as progression goes. So they talk about the Judaic tradition first, and then go into a Christian tradition. So if you wanted to, you could even like listen to this lecture, like listen to this slide about the Judaic tradition, and then read about it in your book, and kind of go back and forth that way. So that's just a suggestion that you could do. Yeah. So Judaic tradition, this is like kind of ancient Hebrew sort of stuff, like in the Middle East, 2,000 years ago, sort of thing. What were their sexual attitudes then? So as far as gender roles, they were highly specialized, meaning the women were expected to be a certain way as far as duties go, and men expected to do a set of behaviors and expectations and duties for them as well. So for women, it was to care for her family, make sure that their well-being is good, and obey her husband in whatever he may request for her to do, and procreate was a big kind of command for women at the time in this culture. But also, this was a little bit different than some other cultures, that they believed that sex was more than just for procreation. So we'll see this theme about sex, kind of like the moral imperative that you should only have sex if it's to make a baby, sort of thing. We'll talk about this in Roman Catholicism. And so, as far as this Judaic tradition, They do think about sex as more than just for procreation. It can also be for bonding between the man and wife. So of course, this was not very progressive at all as far as LGBT is concerned. But yeah. Oh yeah, I was gonna read from Song of Songs. Stern as death is love. It's pretty interesting. Let's take a look at that, and it gives us kind of a little bit of an artistic understanding of what the Judaic tradition was like as far as love goes. So let me search this real quick. I'm going to read it. My fiance and I are getting married in the Catholic Church, and my best man is going to read this, and I thought it was pretty cool. So, Song of Songs, if you're unfamiliar, also called Song of Solomon in the Old Testament of the Bible. So that's why I say that's related to Judaic tradition. So, hark, my lover, here he comes, springing across the mountains, leaping across the hills. My lover is like a gazelle or a young stag. Here he stands behind our wall, gazing through the windows, peering through the lattices. My lover speaks. He says to me, "Arise, my beloved, my dove, my beautiful one, and come. O my dove, in the clefts of the rock, in the secret recesses of the cliff, let me see you, let me hear your voice. For your voice is sweet, and you are lovely. My lover belongs to me, and I to him. He says to me, set me as a seal on your heart, as a seal on your arm. For stern as death is love, relentless as the netherworld is devotion. His flames are blazing fire. Deep waters cannot quench love, nor floods sweep it away. The word of Lord." And that is Song of Psalms, mostly. Looks like chapter 2. A lot of that. And so what I kind of get from that is that it is kind of, well, it is pretty heteronormative, meaning just, man and wife, and kind of like it's like kind of a little bit like a love story or about romance between a man and his wife, and kind of how he's a little bit almost like infatuated. You have that romantic love, that kind of very emotional sort of thing that's within this tradition. So you can kind of safely say that in the Judaic tradition, that romantic love was important. It wasn't just the union between a man and woman was not just to procreate per se, but it was also actually to fulfill this need of like emotional attachment and being enamored by the other person. So we're going to switch to the Christian tradition and talk a lot about that now. So we see a shift here, and we'll see going through the history of sexuality, sexual attitudes and stuff of society. We'll see that culture, you may assume kind of that, the farther we go back in history, the more restrictive society was as far as sexual mores, which is what society deems as appropriate. You may see it as more restrictive and conservative back in time, and then over time we got more and more liberal. So, like in our society, gay marriage being acceptable, and whatnot, kind of seeing that progress over time, but it's more cyclical or something like that. You'll have times where things are more progressive and there's more acceptance and tolerance and gender equity and things like that. It'll be like good like progress for a while, and then more dips in restrictiveness and whatnot, and kind of goes like that. And so here in the Christian tradition, especially from Paul, he was one of the authors of the books in the New Testament, emphasizing, and Christians at the time during the Roman Empire saying, no, sex is just for procreation and it's not about love and pleasure between the two people. And so this was kind of a reaction in the Roman Empire. A lot of cults were forming at the time, and they really emphasized sexuality, kind of very not necessarily flippant sexuality, or like sexuality where you don't care at all about what you're doing, and it's just kind of this hedonistic sort of thing. Hedonism meaning very focused on pleasure. So the Christians kind of were like, this hedonistic type sexuality, this is not what we're about. Like these cults during the Roman Empire, they're much more saying no emphasis on like a sexual sort of relationship, even between husband and wife, much less any other people. So this is a very conservative position. And so I think it's interesting to think about Jesus, though, Jesus of Nazareth, for a little bit, because we have, as we'll see throughout the semester, a lot of clergy and people in power in the Christian tradition, and having so very strict sort of like doctrine and whatnot on sexuality. But then when you look at the root of Christianity, Jesus of Nazareth, you'll see that he doesn't really explain, at least written in the New Testament, doesn't really explain his position on sexuality really at all. So we're kind of left guessing what he had to say about that. And pictured here is Paul, one of the writers I was saying of the New Testament, that he was pretty restrictive on things sexually. And he talked about, and the reason that he kind of made that conclusion about kind of what I'll say is like an anti-hedonistic type view is that the physical was kind of separate from the spiritual. So if you wanted to connect with God, then you need to do that through non-physical means like prayer and whatnot. And that was good. Those were the things that were good, exploring spirituality in that way. But the physical, so like this physical pleasure of having sex and whatnot, was he deemed as kind of debased or bad. So separate. All this was not good, but the spirituality was good. So just being celibate and not even engaging in these physical acts and whatnot was what he said was a good way to go. And you'll see this in Buddhism as well. So it's not just Paul of Tarsus, it's not just Christianity. There's a lot of different traditions that say, celibacy is the way to go if you want to live the spiritual life. So as far as psychology goes of all of this, and you'll see this through any of the traditions that are kind of restrictive, I just wonder, what sort of effect did this have on the individuals, especially who wanted to be more, let's say, hedonistic. So I assume that there was some tension here between the cultures of that time. Yeah. So Bishop Augustine saying that he said that the original sin of Adam and Eve was lust. And if you're unfamiliar with the story of Adam and Eve from Genesis, saying that God created a man, and Adam, and then God created a woman, Eve, and Eve was tempted by Satan or the devil. This is the narrative, and then she wanted to have more power, and so that lust for power was an original sin sort of thing. And so any sort of lusting after what you don't have was seen as one of the original sins of people. So you can look up Bishop Augustine, and he has a lot of writings about this. And he was saying that sex within marriage is okay for procreation. So we see this theme again, that it's just sex within marriage, and of course, just a man and woman, and it's okay for procreation, sort of thing. It's really interesting as a side note that throughout society, these major figures, and I guess even lay people as well, are just so interested and motivated to be involved in how sex goes within society. I think that's really interesting. And he espoused the idea that women should be subordinate to men. Kind of going with that Adam and Eve type story. So this was moving a little bit closer to current times, a little bit. So around like 1000, still seeing sex as sinful within the Christian tradition. So Thomas Aquinas wrote a very long series of books, the Summa Theologica, and in that he talked about a lot of acts that were quote-unquote crimes against nature. So you see this theme just really kind of just people really holding dearly onto this idea that sex needed to be regulated, that it needed to be just between a man and a wife, and just only to have babies, to procreate. So anything that was not that would be a quote-unquote, according to him, crime against nature. So like masturbation, so that does not lead to procreation. That would be a crime against nature. Oral sex, homosexual acts, or anal sex, just anything like that would be a crime against nature, because it's kind of more about sex as pleasure rather sex as procreation. And so people in the Catholic tradition, if they go to confession at their church, and they talk about so during confession, it says using withdrawal to avoid pregnancy was the most serious sin and could require a penance of fasting on bread and water for years. So this is just emphasizing how serious it was to do anything sexually that didn't have to do with procreation. Even using withdrawal as a way to avoid pregnancy. And oral and anal sex, yet again, two different ways of having sex that doesn't lead to procreation, actually had more severe penances to be able to kind of rectify yourself within the Catholic tradition, even more than murder. So this is very interesting for sure. And so, if you will, please check this YouTube video out from about the beginning to minute 2:44. And this is Professor who's talking about a little bit more about Christianity and the theology of sexuality and whatnot. Okay, so your discussion question for this week is going to be, how is morality concerning sexual behavior related to psychology of sexuality? So, if you're unfamiliar, I'm sure everyone is at least vaguely familiar with the definition of morality, but morality being principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong or good and bad behavior. So, like we just talked about, it would be wrong to do any sexual acts that did not lead to procreation, and sex that did lead to procreation was good. That dichotomy there, as far as was morally permissible in the society. So the discussion question is, how is morality concerning sexual behavior, or just sexuality in general, related to the psychology of sexuality? So I will leave that to you guys to contemplate and write about in your discussion questions on Canvas. Check out the syllabus for a description of what I'm looking for in terms of your answers for discussion questions. So, a little bit later, so around the 1500s, we see more of a sex positive shift. Now we're not talking about as probably a sex positive of a culture we are currently, or maybe Europeans are currently, but it at least was heading a little bit towards being a little more liberal. So you had people like Martin Luther and John Calvin, people heavily involved in the Protestant Reformation, kind of saying, we don't agree with the Catholic Church in that sex can only be for procreation. We believe that it is good just to do. So even though it's still, just a man and a woman, is still a little heading towards a little bit more of a liberal viewpoint as far as that goes. So saying that sex between a husband and wife, basically anytime, is good for, creating bonds and love and whatnot. So that's kind of how, at the beginning of Protestantism, how they cut off from the Catholic Church as far as moral restrictions on sexuality. So moving along to the 1700s, we see an increased respect for women. So not so much of a women are this way and their duties are this. And this is in Western Europe that we're talking about here. But saying, women had more of a say-so in who they wanted to become. So we're going to look at Mary Wollstonecraft here for a minute. So she was an author, and I encourage you to look up her book here, Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and look that up. I'm sure it's online for free. Check that out. Some of her prose that's in there about that, and yeah. she was acknowledged for her intelligence, wit, and energy. And so a lot of times in these cultures with really strict gender roles, intelligence and kind of having initiative and things like that, and being really creative in those ways was not necessarily, it wasn't as acceptable. But at least during this period, I think in England at least, women had less restrictions on them for a while. So this was 1792 that this was written. And in this book that she writes, she talks about how the gender roles were, especially for women, were too restrictive. Didn't have enough freedom for individual choice. So she's kind of one of the first feminists who, wrote a substantial argument against strict gender roles. So, for example, that little girls can choose, to develop their intelligence with school books and whatnot, and are not just forced to be that traditional woman of taking care of babies and the house and whatnot. So Mary Wollstonecraft, she's very important. And then the Victorian era, a little bit later, also in England. See, I said we kind of have these times where things get a little more, get a less restrictive as far as gender roles and sexual attitudes, and then sometimes it goes back to being more conservative and more restrictive. I mean, how can you get more restrictive than these devices and whatnot to ensure that no sexuality was occurring? And so you can see in this society, they wanted, like Queen Victoria wanted everyone to be so restrictive about their sexuality that they even made it kind of news to people that masturbation caused blindness and whatnot. And like I said at the beginning, one of the first lectures, thankfully we have psychology and modern science and biology to test these sort of things. So maybe a lot of people actually did believe things like masturbation caused blindness, and then so they tried to avoid ever masturbating so they don't become blind. But thankfully, with the advent of psychology and science, we can actually test these assertions to see if they're true. And of course, this one was not true. It was just a ploy to restrict people in their sexuality. So more about the Victorian era. Of course, as you would imagine, kind of guess, the men and women had highly defined roles, and women were valued for their delicacy, kind of the pomp and circumstance and propriety, and being social with everyone, as opposed to working physically on anything and being a leader in political positions or anything like that. And as far as their sexuality goes, women in the Victorian era, they were viewed as asexual, as in, their sexual desire, orgasm, pleasure, any of that stuff wasn't important / didn't even exist, sort of thing. So they're just said, their sexual life is merely to procreate. We see that again. It has nothing to do with the bond between the man and the woman. So you'll see that kind of like this underlying need for intimacy and emotional connection that they might have had if they were having good sex with their husbands. So kind of what emerged out of that was women having a lot very intensely passionate, intimate, emotionally relationships with other women in order to fulfill that need. So obviously, they encourage self-restraint, temperance, self-restraint on your sexuality. So, as you saw before, as far as masturbation goes, you may have this urge to masturbate, but it's valued highly in the Victorian era to restrain yourself from that. And we'll see in a second here that it ended up being more restraint, really, for women than it did for men overall, as you might have guessed. So prostitution was very prolific in this era, and so the men, even though they weren't having sex with their wives in order to procreate, they still had these sexual urges and needs, and they often met with prostitutes to have sex with them. So it's like their wife was there's this different role for wives and versus prostitutes. So the women were stuck at home, not really able to deviate from the rules as much as men were. And then this was a very cool person, Celia Mosher, and she was one of the first ones who actually did kind of like a psychological, biological, physiological study. She wanted to see, what is actually, what are women's experience of sexuality during this time? And with her, she actually pretty decent study, especially for this time period. She followed 47 married women over a period of 30 years, so longitudinal study. And over that time, asked them specific questions. So, like about their desire. Do you experience sexual desire? Do you have an urge? Do you want to have sex, masturbate, and things like that? Do you enjoy intercourse, or are you more of a person who's the layback and think about the empire sort of gal, and if they experienced orgasm and whatnot? And her research, Moser's research, showed that, as what we would probably expect, that yes, of course, these Victorian women, even though they were supposed to be very chaste and almost basically celibate in a way, they actually do experience all the sexual desire, enjoyment of intercourse, and whatnot. So that's pretty interesting. She's an important person as well. So from your book, I thought this section was interesting as far as the sexuality of slaves. And this is more, we've been talking a lot about kind of Western European religious leaders and political leaders being restrictive on mostly their own race, like white people in power being restrictive of other white people. But now I thought this section was interesting in your book on the sexuality of slaves in the United States, because you'll see here is much more restrictions of white people putting it on to slaves, black people at the time, sort of thing. And so the Europeans going to Africa, as you may recall from history, any history lessons that you've had, was that they reacted to the African customs in a just deplorable way, just terrible way, dehumanizing the people there in Africa as being animalistic and oversexed, and unfortunately, this view became very popular among all of these Europeans who were coming to Africa, and they're like using these sort of derogatory beliefs about them as evidence that it's okay for a lot of terrible things like slavery, first of all. And it's like, well, they're hypersexual, so I mean, it's just terrible stuff that's hard to even talk about. But being like a justification for being white men being able to rape the black women at the time. So this was definitely a very dark period in our history. So the black womanhood as Jezebel is kind of like this stereotype that African women were hypersexual. And as you would imagine, slaves didn't have um, any volition over their own bodies, which is clearly the opposite of what we want in our society. And really, even the males were kind of viewed as hypersexual as well, and very physical, um, and kind of seen in that way. And so your book talks about kind of like this fear for a lot of white men that the black men were actually superior in some way to them. They felt this inferiority towards their masculinity, their build, their ability to um, mm, work and be very productive, sort of thing. And they also believed that they were very able to, black men able to be um, pleasure women to a higher degree maybe than white men. So this, as your book explains, mm, this fear, this white fear of black, caused a lot of violence. So anything that anyone who was kind of mm, rebelling against the system at that time, terrible, terrible things could happen to them, like lynching and rape. And it really doesn't get any better as far as white and black relations. So using a lot of black women as the quote unquote mammy, taking care of kids and doing household duties and whatnot, so the women could retain their delicacy as far as not doing hard manual labor and whatnot. So just terrible things. Okay, so we have Western Europe here, and we're going to talk more in detail about Freud in chapter 2, but we'll just start this now. So around the beginning of the 1900s, Sigmund Freud. And so it's kind of, yeah, Western Europe, Central Europe was pretty relatively restrictive. If we just use that dichotomy of the culture is either liberal or the culture is sexually conservative. The culture at the time was sexually conservative. And so you have this man, arguably very intelligent sort of thing, psychologist, psychiatrist, who's saying, actually, it's very natural for us to have sexual desire and things of that nature. So we'll just leave that there for now, and then pick that up later in chapter 2 about more of his views of sexuality. And then Havelock Ellis. He was a physician, but he was definitely helpful in making people think a little bit more about sexuality and whatnot. And I actually have, believe it or not, I got this from one of the professors at Bowling Green. He gave me this, the Studies in the Psychology of Sex. I have volume 1 and 2 here, and I'm going to read a little bit just so you can have an idea of, what was psychology of sex like at that time. So this was written in, look at this guy. He means business. So this was originally written in 1905. So like 100 years ago. And this was what psychology of sex was like. I thought this part was interesting. It says, homosexuality, I'm just turning to kind of a little bit of a random page. Homosexuality is not less common in women than in men. In the serial-comic theory of sex set forth by Aristophanes in Plato's Symposium, males and females are placed on a footing of complete equality, and, however fantastic, the theory suffices to indicate that to the Greek mind, so familiar with homosexuality, its manifestations seem just as likely to occur in women as in men, as undoubtedly the case. Like other anomalies, indeed, as more pronounced forms, it may be less frequently met with in women. In its less pronounced forms, almost certainly, it is more frequently found. And so it appears as though he's kind of reacting to a lot of cultural assertions at the time that homosexuality differed in men and women, and so he was kind of addressing that. Obviously, it goes into a lot more detail than what I just gave you there. This is a book that you could get from the library or buy just to see and appreciate what it was like. But he was kind of tackling that question of whether men and women had different, what we would call in our society in science, we would say prevalence rates. So the prevalence rates of, and get very specific, either sexual desire towards other people, opposite sex versus same sex, and that's what we would see when we compare prevalence rates, which we actually will. We'll go through what the prevalence of homosexuality is within women versus men. So he started tackling this at the time and came to the conclusion, no, it may be actually pretty equal. So we'll see on that. But he really helped in this series of books here say, and you could see him as being pretty radical at the time, saying that all non-harmful sexual acts are healthy. So he's coming from a physician's perspective, kind of like a psychologist physician, saying that, even just so things like same-sex acts are healthy. They're not harming anyone, and things of that nature. We talked about like anal sex, oral sex, and things like that. So we talked about before, like any act that is not for procreation was sinful. And so he's coming from more of a medical psychologist type perspective, saying, no, actually, any non-harmful sexual acts are healthy. And so it may be looking at, comparing apples and oranges. You have the religious tradition, and then for him you have the medical tradition. But he's saying it's healthy, and the other people are saying it's sinful, so you have that tension there. He also wrote on life and sex in the 1920s. And see, he was helpful again here, saying that that women have the right to sex. And this is kind of definitely different than the Victorian era that we were talking about, who would say women don't even have the desire for sex, much less the right to sex. So, beginning of the 20th century, the women's suffrage movement. It's just baffling to me when I think about how long society went for saying that women couldn't vote, but men could. I don't see how this made sense, and it's hard for me to kind of understand like how this could have happened for so long. But thankfully, beginning of 19th century, women gained, at least white women, gained some footing in being able to vote. So 1920s, white women were able to vote because of the 19th Amendment, and able to attend university and own property. So that was good, at least. But women of color were not able to vote until 1965. So it was a really long time for people to stand for that injustice throughout time. So also around this time was World War I, and it actually increased gender equality and flexibility as far as gender roles, because a lot of men were being deployed out and to fight in World War One, but we had all these jobs in America that still had to be fulfilled. And so a lot of women started coming into the workforce and make up for that loss there. And so for, however long in history, a lot of societies saw that, women don't go out to work. They don't do that. They're not meant for that. And what men are meant for to go out and work. And it's like, well, this World War kind of made things turn on its head a little bit, and really, I'm sure, made people question. It's like, well, they're actually, of course, as you would imagine, good at doing these sort of jobs and everything. So good for women in that way. And so around this time, also more liberal experiences were happening during this time. So the men who were overseas in Europe introduced to more liberal sexuality. And so around the 1920s, so just a little bit after this, you have Henry Ford's automobile. And now you may think at first thought, oh, well, this isn't necessarily all this significant to sexuality, but it kind of was. It gave people the opportunity to get out of the house, away from parental figures and things like that, out on their own in a lot easier way. So you have these people who are couples and people who are attracted to each other. They have this privacy and more opportunity to be sexual with each other. And then movies at the time were also kind of more proponents of pushing society to a liberal standpoint. And so we have the flappers here, like these ladies on the left, who exposed more of their skin in the way that they dressed and they danced. And this was definitely not not okay in the eyes of people like Southern Baptists at the time, but they danced, and they also danced with other people, kind of a close body to body contact, which was different for this time period. So check this video out, and it's about the flappers. So it's kind of like the feminist revolution in the 1920s. So check out that YouTube video, watch all of that. And so your reflection question, like you have a discussion question once a week. You also have a reflection question once a week. So just write this in a Word document and upload it to Canvas under the reflection question. And, try to write about 5 sentences, be good about grammar, punctuation, spelling, all those sort of things. But the reflection question, the discussion questions are more kind of intellectual sort of thing, and these reflection questions are more introspective and personal. So how do you feel that women weren't able to vote till the 20s, or women of color until 1965? And do you think this historical imbalance of men having the power in society and politics and whatnot has any bearing on the psychology of women and beliefs about that men have about women and beliefs that women have about themselves? And so spend some time reflecting on that we're able to vote now, but also reflect on what would that have been like to be a woman at that time during those time periods. What would that have felt like for you? And then we have, after World War II, so it became very normative and kind of acceptable or a desired thing for people to live in the suburbs. So this very, very heteronormative sort of narrative of the man going out into the world, making money, and then the women are back in the houses. So in World War I, they were working out of the houses, but then now, so after World War II, more back in those norms and stereotypes. Women were supposed to be inside and cooking and cleaning and things, and men making money. It's kind of a should sort of statement. Like society should run that way. And I think in the psychoanalytic tradition, which is like people like Sigmund Freud and others had theories at the time that women who did want to work, that really they just wanted to be men. It was so hard for people to understand at the time that a woman couldn't identify as being a woman, but also productive and creative in the world. The theorists at the time just concluded, oh, they must want to be a man if they're doing manly things. In the fashion industry, we feminized women, so we went from that, we went to more of this like women clothing really emphasizing their hips, and so that childbearing sort of demand on women. So still around the same time, sex to a lot of people, if you just ask someone, was just the very most simple, straightforward sort of definition that people would have. That it's just, a man and a woman having intercourse, sort of thing. And that was sex. There was not much thought about oral sex, anal sex, same-sex behavior, and things like that. So those rigid gender roles. And then the more and more studies that are done on imposing gender roles onto people, the more and more we see in psychology of sexuality that it is harmful to people. So experiencing things like depression and whatnot, feeling trapped in a particular role and not having that sort of freedom. So after World War II, so this was still around the same time, we have these post-war retreat into traditional gender roles like we talked about, and then returning to the workplace. So we've already covered everything that's on this slide. So around the same time, and we'll talk about Alfred Kinsey in chapter 2 in detail, but he wrote sexual behavior in the human male and in the human female. And medical professionals at the time were pretty uncomfortable about what some of the things that he wrote about. And so he had these very, very rigorous interviews with people asking them all about their sexual life. A whole lot of people, relatively diverse group of people as well. And so, and through these interviews, he wrote these books. And around the 50s, people were pretty sexually conservative, so they kind of wanted to be sheltered and believe, that sex is really just about a man and a wife having sex for procreation, sort of thing. And he's like, well, that's not really how people are, actually. So this book was pretty kind of revolutionary in a way, just good science, really. Like, what are the facts about people's sexual lives? So this is another book you could buy online or get through the library or something like that to just look through, and it would be a good supplement to what we're talking about in class. And so the prevalence of sexual interest, this is kind of like that other person we talked about, I think Mosher, who's saying, no, women do have sexual interest, and people were actually really surprised by this for some reason. And other surprises that people, engaged in same-sex behavior, masturbation, and things that are, commonplace knowledge for us today, but it was actually surprising to them at the time. And so you have the 60s and 70s, which was a real rebellion against gender roles in some way, and anything very restrictive as far as sexuality goes. So as you see pictured here, like people in relationships that was not just one man and one woman, but maybe multiple people in some sort of relationship or sexual behaviors and whatnot. And this was very different at the time. A lot different thinking and behaviors and whatnot. And so at the time, this was when contraceptives were introduced, and science said, women can take these contraceptives and not have and not be impregnated. So that really helped with as far as opening up the opportunities of people to connect with each other sexually, but take off the table pregnancy and having a child and things like that. So we talked so much about how in society we have you said sex is just between a man and a woman for procreation, and then definitely in America in the 60s and 70s, this was not the case. You could have sex just for pleasure. So we're looking at that more hedonistic type view of sexuality that we talked about before with the cults during the Roman Empire and whatnot that Christianity separated itself from. And so contraceptive use was legal in 1965. Take a moment to think about what life was like before that when contraceptive use was illegal. It was pretty shocking to think about the government being that restrictive on one's own sexuality. And it wasn't until 1972 that unmarried couples, so from 1965 to 1971 or so, unmarried couples could not use contraceptives legally. And then 1972, Roe versus Wade saying that abortion was legal. So all these sort of things in society leading up to a more permissive sexual attitudes. You can have sex for pleasure and separate that from procreation. Then 66, in 1970, Masters and Johnson came on the scene. So they mostly had direct observation of people having sex and kind of analyzed it almost mostly from a physiological standpoint. Society loosened up just a little bit, enough in America to allow Masters and Johnson to do this sort of research. And it's really good science. It's just, we've been wondering for, thousands of years about sexuality and people. No one's actually had, people actually having sex with each other and someone observing and taking notes and things like that. So that's what you got here. And one of the big takeaways from Masters and Johnson's work was that women had the ability to have intense sexual pleasure, like orgasms. And sex therapy kind of came on the scene at that time. So, like later, we'll talk about how we'll talk a lot about how taking the pressure off of um, intercourse and just focusing on cuddling and touching, sensate focused therapy as a type of sex therapy can help people with like performance type sexual dysfunctions. Um, so like erectile dysfunction due to performance anxiety and whatnot. So there was sex therapy being introduced at the time to help people just engage in intercourse and experience that intimacy with their partner. Our Bodies, Ourselves in 1971, first sexual self-help book for women. So that's great. And then in the 60s and 70s, we also have, the gay community finally being able to come out some and say, we're here. And I guess society for a long time wanted to just ignore and oppress that part of our society. And thankfully, during the 60s and 70s, so you have 1970 here on this banner, Gay Liberation Day. And so there was a movement towards people having, rights over their own, how they want to be sexual. And then we'll talk about this more in depth, I think. In 1973, American Psychiatric Association, the APA, the main organization that stands today that is responsible for things like the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Psychiatric Disorders, the DSM. The APA is the main organization they actually had. As you may already know, homosexuality as a mental disorder, which is another deplorable thing that we are going through in our slides today. So thankfully, after 1973, they saw it as much more normative and completely healthy to be gay, of course. So that concludes this lecture on the historical sort of aspect of sexuality in your chapter 1. And I'll have another lecture on chapter 1 as well. That'll touch on different things and not necessarily this chronological progression of what were sexual attitudes like in Europe and the Middle East, 2,000 years ago, up until the 60s and 70s in the U.S. So it's important to remember there was this cyclical pattern of at times things becoming more permissive and at times things becoming more restrictive. All right, thanks guys.